Hello everyone, welcome to my channel.
My name is Cassandra Vance. I am 23 years old, and my life in this luxury Portland estate was built on the ashes of a family that threw me away like trash. The rain was drumming against the reinforced glass of my foyer when the doorbell rang at 2 in the morning, a sound that shouldn't exist in a neighborhood this private. I opened the door to see Meredith and Grant Vance standing there looking bedraggled, but carrying that same suffocating aura of entitlement I hadn't seen in 7 years. Behind me, Silas Thorne walked into the hallway, his feet bare against the cold marble. As he carried 2 glasses of water, his eccentric presence instantly drawing their predatory gaze. My mother's eyes darted from Silas's unkempt beard to his lack of shoes, her lip curling in a mix of disgust and sudden sharp greed. "Who is this man, you selfish brat?" she shrieked, her voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling while her hand tightened on a knockoff designer purse. My father didn't even look at me. He was busy calculating the square footage of the room before he added, "You should know he's my age, Cassandra, but if he gives us $500,000 to compensate for your shame, we might consider this settled." I stood my ground, feeling the weight of the silence from Silas, and looked straight at the man who shared my DNA but none of my soul. "What do you need from me?" I asked, my voice as cold as the storm outside. "Before we continue with my story, please let me know what time it is and which city you are watching from, so I can see how far my story has traveled. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment if you want to see those who betray family get exactly what they deserve." 7 years before that midnight confrontation, the world I knew ended on a Tuesday night in our suburban Seattle home. I was 16, clutching a chemistry textbook, when Grant and Meredith called me into the kitchen, where Brianna was already sitting smirking behind a glass of expensive orange juice. The air in the room felt thin, vibrating with a decision they had clearly made long before they invited me to hear it. My father laid out a set of legal documents on the table, his fingers tapping on the granite countertop that he still owed the bank for. He explained that Brianna had been accepted into an elite art conservatory in New York, a place that cost more per year than our combined annual income. To fund her destiny, they had taken out a second mortgage and emptied every cent of the savings account that was supposed to be my college fund. Meredith didn't even look guilty when she told me that my bedroom was being converted into a studio for Brianna's summer projects before she left, and since the house was being downsized soon anyway, there was no room for me. They had packed my life into one duffel bag and a cardboard box, claiming that at 16 I was resilient enough to figure it out, while they focused on the child who actually had a future. I remember the sound of the rain starting just as my father handed me a bus pass and $50, telling me that I was a strong girl and that Brianna needed this more than I did. I walked out of that house and down the driveway, my shoes soaking through, instantly feeling the immense betrayal of being traded for a sister's whim. My Aunt Clara was waiting at the end of the block in her rusted-out sedan, her face streaked with tears as she watched her own sister exile her child. Clara was a cleaning lady who lived in a one-bedroom apartment in a part of the city where the streetlights were usually broken, and she was the only one who had dared to protest. She grabbed my bag and pulled me into a hug that smelled like cheap detergent and honest love, whispering that she wished she had more to give. My parents had told her that if she helped me, they would cut her off too, but Clara had never cared for their hollow status symbols. We drove away in silence, the red taillights of my childhood home disappearing in the mist, as Brianna watched us from the upstairs window, never once waving goodbye. That night, I slept on a thin mattress on Clara's kitchen floor, listening to the hum of her ancient refrigerator and vowing that I would never be small again. I realized then that my parents didn't see people. They saw investments, and I was a stock they had decided to dump. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the coldness in Meredith's gaze, a mother who had decided her daughter was an obstacle to her social climbing. The next morning, I didn't cry. I got up at 5 in the morning and started looking for any job that would hire a 16-year-old with no permanent address. I worked 3 shifts back-to-back washing dishes at a diner, folding clothes at a laundromat, and eventually helping a local carpenter haul scrap wood. My hands grew calloused and my heart grew hard-fueled by the memory of Brianna's smug face as she watched me get kicked out of my own life. I spent my nights at the public library teaching myself about architectural drafting and structural integrity from books that were decades old. Aunt Clara would come home with aching back and swollen feet, yet she always made sure there was a bowl of soup waiting for me on the counter. She was the one who taught me that family isn't about the blood in your veins, but the people who don't let you drown when the tide comes in. I watched her struggle to pay her own rent while my parents posted photos on social media of Brianna's new loft in Manhattan bought with the money that should have been my security. They were living a lie built on the theft of my future, and they did it with a smile. Every dollar I saved went into a hidden jar under Clara's sink, a growing pile of crumpled 5s and 10s that represented my escape plan. I didn't want their house or their approval anymore. I wanted to build something so massive that they would eventually have to look up just to see the shadow it cast. Those early years in Seattle were a blur of exhaustion and hunger, but they stripped away the girl who needed a mother. In her place was a woman who understood the value of every nail and every brick, someone who knew that the most beautiful structures are often built from the ruins. I never called them, and they never checked on me, not even on my 17th or 18th birthdays. It was as if I had ceased to exist the moment I stepped off their property, a ghost they had successfully exorcised to make room for their golden child. Life in Aunt Clara's neighborhood was a relentless grind of noise heat, and the constant fear of being one paycheck away from the sidewalk. I spent 3 years in that cramped apartment, my world defined by the schedules of 3 different city buses and the heavy scent of sawdust that never left my hair. My first real job was at a demolition site, where I convinced the foreman I could sort salvageable materials better than any of his veteran workers. While other teenagers were going to prom or worrying about SAT scores, I was identifying mahogany beams and vintage brass fixtures in the wreckage of old Victorian homes. Aunt Clara was struggling with a chronic back injury from years of scrubbing floors, but she refused to let me pay more than a fraction of the rent, insisting I save every cent for my education. I watched her limp into the bathroom every morning, swallowing generic painkillers so she could go clean the houses of women who looked exactly like my mother. It burned me to see her work so hard for so little, while Grant and Meredith were likely hosting dinner parties in a house they couldn't actually afford. I started taking night classes at a community college, majoring in historical preservation, while working 40 hours a week during the day. There were nights when I was so tired I would fall asleep on the bus and wake up at the end of the line miles from home with nothing but a cold bagel in my pocket. My sister Brianna was posting updates from her gallery openings in Chelsea, her lifestyle funded by the equity my parents had drained from my life. She was a mediocre artist at best, but she had the Vance name and the Vance money, which was apparently enough to buy her a seat at the table. I, on the other hand, was learning how to restore the very foundations of the city, working in the mud and the grit, to understand how things truly held together. One winter, the heating in Clara's building failed for 2 weeks, and we huddled together under a mountain of thrift store blankets, breathing in plumes of white mist. I remember looking at Clara's shivering hands and promising her that I would buy her a house with the best heating system in the world. She just laughed softly, her voice raspy from a cold she couldn't shake, and told me that she already had everything she needed because I was there. That was the difference between my mother and my aunt. Meredith wanted a trophy, but Clara wanted a family. I started picking up freelance restoration work for small homeowners who couldn't afford big firms, using the tools I had slowly bought one by one. I would spend my weekends in drafty basements and rotting attics, bringing life back to forgotten woodwork and tired masonry. My reputation began to grow in the local community of craftsmen because I didn't mind the grime, and I had a photographic memory for architectural details. I wasn't just fixing houses. I was fixing myself layer by layer, replacing the rot of betrayal with the solid oak of self-reliance. I learned how to negotiate with suppliers who tried to overcharge me, and how to handle contractors who didn't want to take orders from a 19-year-old girl. Every time someone doubted me, I thought of the night I was kicked out, and the anger turned into a cold, focused energy that allowed me to work 20 hours straight. I saved every invoice, every scrap of blueprint, and every penny, building a portfolio that showed the transformation of ruins into masterpieces. Clara became my unofficial office manager, taking calls on her lunch breaks and keeping my chaotic paperwork organized in a series of colorful folders. We were a team of two against a world that didn't care if we disappeared into the cracks of the pavement. I started to see that my parents' abandonment had inadvertently given me a superpower. I was invisible, which meant I could move through the world without anyone seeing me coming. I didn't need a fancy office or a marketing budget. I had the work, and the work spoke for itself in a language that money couldn't fake. As I neared my 20th birthday, I had enough saved to move us into a slightly better area, but Clara refused to leave, saying we needed to keep the overhead low so I could eventually start my own firm. She believed in my dream more than I did, some days standing in that tiny kitchen and telling me I was going to be the greatest architect in the Pacific Northwest. I didn't tell her that my motivation wasn't greatness, it was the sheer refusal to ever be at the mercy of people like Grant and Meredith again. I was building a fortress around my life, brick by brick, ensuring that no one could ever throw me out into the rain again. The trajectory of my life shifted permanently on a sweltering July afternoon when I was scouted while working on a crumbling library in downtown Seattle. I was perched on a scaffold, my face covered in dust, meticulously stripping layers of lead paint from a hand-carved frieze when I noticed a man standing below. He was wearing an expensive linen suit that looked like it had been slept in. His hair was a chaotic nest of gray, and most notably, he was completely barefoot on the dirty construction floor. This was Silas Thorne, a man whose name was whispered in hushed tones among the architectural elite, a billionaire who had retreated from the public eye to live a life of high-end minimalism. He watched me work for nearly an hour without saying a word, his eyes tracking the precision of my movements as if he were reading a musical score. When I finally climbed down to get more solvent, he didn't introduce himself. He simply pointed to a section of the frieze and told me I was using the wrong tension on the scraper for that specific type of aged cedar. I snapped back that I was adjusting for the humidity of the building's interior, and he let out a short, barking laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He told me his name and offered me a job on the spot, not as an assistant, but as a lead consultant for a project he called the Ghost Estate in the hills of Portland. I knew who he was, of course. He was the man who had designed the most iconic, sustainable structures in the country before vanishing into his own legend. He told me he liked that I didn't have a formal degree from an Ivy League school, because it meant I hadn't been taught how to be boring yet. I accepted his offer on one condition: that I could bring my own administrative staff, which meant Aunt Clara was finally retiring from cleaning houses to become my executive coordinator. Silas didn't care. He lived in a world where results were the only currency he recognized, and he saw in me a hunger that matched his own. We moved to Portland a month later, leaving behind the ghosts of Seattle for a sprawling property that Silas wanted to turn into a masterpiece of historical preservation and modern technology. Silas was a man of strange habits, often walking his grounds barefoot to feel the soul of the land, a practice he claimed helped him understand where the weight of a building should rest. He became the mentor I never had, challenging my every assumption and pushing me to see the hidden geometry in the natural world. Under his guidance, I didn't just restore buildings. I learned how to manipulate light, sound, and space to create environments that felt alive. My company, Vance Preservation, was born in the library of his estate with Silas as my silent partner and Clara managing the mounting tide of high-profile contracts. We specialized in the impossible restoring ruins that every other firm had declared beyond saving. As my bank account began to swell with figures that made my head spin, I made sure Clara had a private wing in the estate, filled with the finest furniture and a medical team to look after her back. I bought myself a modest but high-performance car and clothes that were durable but whispered of wealth, yet I kept my public profile non-existent. I didn't want the fame. I wanted the leverage that came with being the only person who could do what I did. Silas and I worked in a strange productive silence, two outcasts who had found a common language in the bones of old structures. He taught me that money was just a tool for autonomy, a way to say no to the people who tried to dictate your worth. I watched him turn down government contracts worth tens of millions because he didn't like the energy of the officials involved, and I realized that was the level of power I wanted. I wanted to be so successful that I could choose who existed in my world and who didn't. While I was building this hidden empire, I occasionally checked the news from my old life, seeing that Brianna's art career had plateaued into a series of embarrassing failures. My parents were still trying to maintain the facade of wealth, but I could see the cracks in their social media posts, the recycled outfits, the desperate tags of luxury brands that didn't follow them back. They were drowning in a sea of their own making while I was learning how to command the tides. I spent my 21st and 22nd birthdays working late into the night with Silas, celebrating with nothing but expensive scotch and blueprints. He never asked about my family, and I never volunteered the information. We were both people who had started our lives at the moment we left our pasts behind. I was no longer the girl with the duffel bag in the rain. I was the architect of my own destiny, and the foundations were finally solid. By the time I turned 23, my firm had reached a level of success that felt surreal, with a client list that included tech moguls and international royalty. We had just finished the restoration of a 17th-century manor that we had shipped piece by piece from Europe, a project that put me on the cover of Architectural Digest. I used a pseudonym for the article, C.V. Thorne, letting the world think I was perhaps Silas's daughter, or a distant relative, to keep the vultures at bay. Aunt Clara was living her best life. Her health had improved dramatically, and she spent her days overseeing the staff at our Portland headquarters with a stern but kind hand. However, the peace I had built was shattered when a local business journal published a small candid photo of me and Silas at a charity auction. I wasn't looking at the camera, but my profile was unmistakable, and the caption identified me as the driving force behind the Thorne Vance resurgence. It took exactly 48 hours for the rot of my past to find its way to my doorstep. I learned through a private investigator I had hired years ago that my parents were in a state of total financial collapse. Brianna had been sued by a gallery for a massive advance she couldn't repay after failing to produce a single viable painting in 2 years. To cover her legal fees and keep her out of jail, Grant had embezzled funds from his real estate firm, a desperate move that had resulted in his immediate firing and a looming criminal investigation. They had lost the Seattle house to foreclosure and were living in a cramped 2-bedroom rental in a part of town they would have previously mocked. The irony was almost too much to bear. They had destroyed me to save Brianna, and now Brianna had destroyed them. I sat in my office looking at the photos of their dilapidated rental and the stressed, aging faces of Meredith and Grant. There was no pity in my heart, only a cold sense of mathematical justice. They had bet everything on a hollow promise, and lost while the resilient child they had discarded was now sitting on a fortune they couldn't even comprehend. Brianna had returned home from New York with nothing but a drug habit and a sense of entitlement that had only grown more toxic with her failure. She was blaming our parents for not giving her enough support, while Grant and Meredith were frantically searching for a miracle to save them from homelessness. When they saw that photo in the journal, they didn't see a daughter they had wronged. They saw a life raft. I started getting calls from unknown numbers, dozens of them a day, which I ignored with a practiced hand. Then came the emails filled with, "We miss you," and "We were always so proud of your independent spirit," lies so transparent they were insulting. Meredith even had the audacity to message Clara begging her to facilitate a meeting, claiming that she had made a mistake in a moment of extreme stress 7 years ago. Clara showed me the messages, her hand shaking with rage, and asked if I wanted her to block them. I told her no. I wanted to see how far they would go before they showed their true colors. I knew the Vance playbook: they would start with affection, move to guilt, and end with demands. True to form, the emails shifted within a week. Grant started mentioning family obligations and how it was my moral duty to help Brianna during her medical recovery. They had no idea that I knew every detail of their downfall, from the bank statements to the court summons. I was watching them through a glass wall, observing their desperation like a scientist studying a dying culture. Silas noticed the change in my energy and asked if I needed him to handle the intrusion. He had a team of lawyers and fixers who could make people disappear legally and financially with a single phone call. I told him no. This was a project I needed to finish myself. I realized that my success wouldn't be complete until I saw the look on their faces when they realized exactly what they had thrown away. I began to plan a reunion, but not on their terms. I wanted them to come to me to see the scale of my life and to feel the crushing weight of their own insignificance. I arranged for a leak to reach them, suggesting that I was living at Silas Thorne's private estate as his protégé and companion. I knew Grant's mind would immediately jump to the most scandalous conclusion, thinking I was trading favors for a lifestyle I hadn't earned. It was a test of their character, one I knew they would fail with flying colors. I wanted them to come to my door with their greed on full display, so I could finally close the book on the Vance family forever. Grant and Meredith spent 3 days staking out the gates of the Thorne estate, their battered sedan looking like a stain on the pristine driveway of the neighborhood. I watched them through the security cameras, seeing my father pacing back and forth, checking his watch, while Meredith reapplied her smeared lipstick in the visor mirror. They looked desperate, like predators who hadn't eaten in weeks, their eyes darting toward every delivery truck and gardener that passed through the gates. They didn't know that I had instructed the security team to let them wait, to let the humidity and the frustration build until they were ready to explode. On the 4th night, I gave the order to open the gates, allowing them to drive up the long, winding path to the main house. The estate was illuminated by hidden lights that made the ancient oaks look like silver giants, and the sound of the waterfall near the entrance was a constant, low roar. They pulled their car right up to the front steps, Grant jumping out before the engine had even fully stopped, his eyes wide as he took in the sheer scale of the stone facade. Meredith followed, tripping slightly on the gravel in her cheap heels, her face a mask of faux concern and practiced longing. I was waiting in the great hall, standing near the massive fireplace with Silas, who was as usual barefoot and dressed in a simple, oversized sweater. I had told Silas to stay silent and let me lead, wanting to see exactly how they would play their hand. When the butler opened the doors, my parents rushed in, their voices filling the space with a cacophony of fake endearments. Meredith tried to run toward me with her arms open, but I stepped back behind a heavy oak table, my expression as flat as a sheet of ice. "Cassie, oh my God, we've searched everywhere for you," she cried, her eyes already scanning the room for valuables while she pretended to wipe away a tear. Grant followed her, his hand extended as if we were business partners who hadn't seen each other in a week, rather than a daughter he had abandoned. He ignored me almost immediately, his gaze fixing on Silas with a mix of suspicion and hidden delight. "So this is the man we've heard about," Grant said, his voice dropping into a tone he thought sounded authoritative, but actually sounded pathetic. He didn't even acknowledge that his daughter was standing right there. He went straight for the man he thought was holding the checkbook. Silas just stared at him, his silence more powerful than any insult, his barefoot stance making him look grounded, while Grant looked like he was vibrating with nervous greed. Meredith finally stopped her fake crying when she saw Silas's appearance, her lip curling just as it would on the night of our final confrontation. "Is this how you're living, Cassandra?" she asked, her voice sharpening. "In this beautiful house with this—" She gestured toward Silas as if he were a piece of furniture that didn't fit the decor. I watched them for a moment, seeing the years of resentment and arrogance still bubbling just beneath the surface of their poverty. They hadn't changed at all. They were just poorer versions of the same people who had kicked me out at 16. They hadn't come to apologize or to find their daughter. They had come to evaluate a new asset. Grant stepped closer to Silas, ignoring the no-shoes policy of the house, and began a rambling speech about family values and the cost of raising a daughter in today's world. He mentioned Brianna's artistic temperament and how the family had invested everything into their children, including me. The lie was so bold it was almost impressive. He was trying to set the stage for a shakedown, painting a picture of a devoted father who had finally found his lost lamb in the clutches of a wealthy hermit. I could see him calculating the settlement in his head, his eyes flickering toward the gold leaf detailing on the ceiling. Meredith joined in, talking about the heartbreak they had endured when I ran away and how they had spent every night praying for my return. I felt a surge of cold fury remembering the nights I spent on Clara's floor while they were posting photos of Brianna's New York loft. They were rewriting history in real time, and they expected me to play along for the sake of the family name. I let them talk for nearly 20 minutes, their stories becoming more elaborate and their demands more transparent with every passing second. They were so blinded by the wealth around them that they didn't see the trap I had set. They didn't realize that the woman standing before them was the owner of the firm that held the primary debt on their failing investments. They were standing in a house owned by a man they were insulting, talking to a daughter they had sold out, and they thought they were the ones in control. The atmosphere in the grand hall shifted from desperate pleading to cold, hard negotiation as my parents realized that their sentimental approach wasn't getting a reaction. Silas Thorne sat on a low stone bench near the window, his bare feet tucked under him, watching the scene with the detached interest of a judge. Grant took a deep breath, straightened his stained tie, and looked Silas directly in the eye, completely bypassing me as if I were a piece of property being discussed at an auction. "Look, Mr. Thorne, let's be men of the world about this." Grant started, his voice dripping with a nauseating faux camaraderie. "Our Cassandra is a beautiful girl, and clearly she's found a very comfortable life here with you. But you have to understand the optics for a family of our standing. To have our youngest daughter living with a man of your vintage without any formal arrangement, it's a heavy burden on our reputation." I almost laughed at the mention of reputation from a man who was 3 weeks away from a bankruptcy hearing. Meredith nodded vigorously, her hand resting on a Ming vase as if she already owned it. "We've suffered so much, Mr. Thorne. The legal fees for our eldest, the loss of our family home. It's all been so much. We're willing to keep this arrangement private and go our separate ways, but we need to ensure Brianna's future is secure." Then came the line that I had heard in my nightmares. "If you can provide us with $500,000, we'll consider our parental obligations fulfilled and leave Cassandra in your very capable hands." Silas didn't move a muscle, but his eyes flickered toward me, a silent question asking if I had heard enough. I stepped forward, the heels of my boots clicking sharply on the marble, breaking the predatory trance my parents were in. $500,000. I asked, my voice steady and deceptively soft. "Is that the current market rate for a daughter you haven't spoken to in 7 years? Or is that just what it costs to keep Brianna out of the minimum security prison she's headed for?" Meredith's face contorted, the mask of the loving mother finally shattered beyond repair. "You shut your mouth, you ungrateful little brat," She spat, her voice echoing off the high walls. You have no idea what we did for you. We gave you life, and this is how you repay us, by shacking up with a barefoot old man in a house that isn't yours. Silas finally spoke, his voice a low melodic rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floor. Actually, Meredith, you're mistaken on several points. First, I am not with Cassandra in the way your sordid mind imagines. She is my partner, my equal, and in many ways my superior in the field of architecture. And second, he paused, leaning forward so the light hit the sharp angles of his face. This house doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the Vance Preservation Group. Cassandra is the sole owner. I am merely a tenant in her brilliance. The silence that followed was so thick it felt like it was choking the air out of the room. Grant's jaw literally dropped, his eyes darting between Silas and me as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that was missing half its pieces. Sole owner, he whispered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. That's impossible. You were 16. You had nothing. I walked over to the oak table and picked up a thick manila folder I had prepared earlier that evening. I tossed it onto the table in front of them, the heavy thud sounding like a gavel. I had nothing because you took it all? I said, looking Grant in the eye. But you forgot one thing you taught me, that people are just investments. So I invested in myself. I worked 3 jobs. I lived in a slum with Aunt Clara while you were buying Brianna's New York gallery space, and I learned a trade that you couldn't even understand. I pointed to the folder. Inside those documents, you'll find the deed to the rental property you're currently living in. I bought the mortgage from the bank last month. I also bought the outstanding debt on Brianna's legal settlements. You don't owe the bank $500,000, Grant. You owe me. Meredith looked like she was going to faint, her hand clutching the Ming vase so hard her knuckles were white. You can't do this. We're your parents, she shrieked. But the conviction was gone, replaced by a raw animal fear. You're not parents, I countered, my voice rising for the first time. You're just people I used to know who made a very bad bet. You sold my future to buy Brianna a dream she was too lazy to earn, and now the bill is due. Grant scrambled to open the folder, his hands shaking so violently he tore several of the pages. He stared at the signatures, the bank seals, and the clear, unmistakable evidence that his discarded daughter now held the leash to his life. Cassie, honey, we can talk about this. He stammered, his man-of-the-world persona collapsing into a puddle of desperation. We were just stressed, we didn't mean to. We were always so proud of you. I looked at Silas, who gave me a small approving nod, and then I looked back at the ruins of my family. The time for talking ended 7 years ago in the rain, I said. Now there's only the business of settling the account. The finality of my words seemed to strip the last of the warmth from the room, leaving Grant and Meredith looking like hollowed-out versions of themselves. I didn't wait for them to process the shock. I had already signaled for Aunt Clara to join us. She walked into the hall dressed in a sharp, elegant navy suit, her posture straight and her eyes clear for the first time in decades. When Meredith saw her sister, she tried to muster one last shred of her old arrogance. Clara, you're part of this. You've been plotting against your own family, she hissed, but her voice lacked its usual sting. Clara didn't even flinch. She stood next to me, her hand resting firmly on my shoulder. I haven't been plotting, Meredith, Clara said, her voice calm and heavy with years of suppressed truth. I've been watching a brilliant young woman build a life out of the scraps you threw her. And I've been waiting for the day you'd finally have to face what you did. I turned to the security guard standing near the entrance and nodded. Grant, Meredith, you have exactly 10 minutes to leave this property. Tomorrow morning you will receive a formal notice from my legal team. Since I own your current residence, I am initiating the eviction process. You have 30 days to find a new place to live, which I imagine will be difficult, given that I am also reporting your outstanding debts to the national credit bureaus. Grant looked like he wanted to scream, but no sound came out. He was staring at the reality of a blacklist status that would prevent him from ever renting so much as a storage unit in this country again. And as for Brianna, I added, looking at my mother, I'm not paying her legal fees. I've already contacted the gallery's lawyers and informed them that I am the new holder of her debt. I will be pursuing every legal avenue to recover those funds, including the seizure of any assets she has left. Meredith finally lost it, throwing her purse at me in a fit of rage, but it missed and hit the floor with a dull thud. "You monster! We gave you everything!" she screamed as the security guards stepped forward to escort them out. I watched them being led away, their voices fading into the distance as they were forced back into their battered car. There was no surge of joy, no cinematic moment of triumph. There was only a profound sense of closure. The invisible child had finally become too big for them to ignore, but by then I didn't need them to see me. Silas walked over to the fireplace, his bare feet silent on the floor, and looked at me with a quiet respect. "It's done, Cassandra," he said simply. I nodded, feeling a massive weight lift from my chest. A week later, I moved Aunt Clara into the master suite of a beautiful Victorian home I had restored in a much better part of the city, a house with a heating system that would keep her warm for the rest of her life. My parents and Brianna ended up in a government-subsidized apartment on the outskirts of the state, their credit scores ruined and their reputations in tatters. They tried to sue me, of course, but no lawyer would take a case against a woman with my resources and a paper trail that proved every cent they owed. They were eventually forced to take minimum-wage jobs to avoid jail time for the embezzlement, experiencing the same grind they had forced on me when I was just a child. I never looked back. This journey taught me that blood doesn't make a family, loyalty and sacrifice do. My parents' abandonment wasn't my end. It was the harsh, necessary fire that forged me into the woman I am today. I learned that in America, you can't always rely on the people who are supposed to love you, but you can always rely on the foundations you build for yourself. Success isn't just about the numbers in a bank account. It's about the power to protect the people who actually stood by you when you had nothing. I am Cassandra Vance, and I am no longer a ghost in anyone's story. I am the architect of my own. This story illustrates a harsh but vital truth about resilience and self-worth. In a world where even those closest to us can be blinded by greed and favoritism, the only true security is the strength we build within ourselves. Abandonment can either break you or become the fuel for an unstoppable rise. The value of family is not found in a shared name, but in the consistent support of those who see your potential when you are at your lowest. Never let someone else's low estimation of you define your ceiling. Instead, use their neglect as the blueprint for your own empire. This is a powerful narrative of justice and self-made success. It reminds us that while we cannot choose our past, we have absolute control over how we architect our future. May everyone find the strength to turn their invisible years into a legacy that can't be ignored.